So I didn't get this clear. Did your parents move to US, then you got born in US, right?
Yes.
Why did they move?
Right. So I think like a lot of, if I'm speaking on behalf of South Asian immigrants of my father's time, so he left India to do his postgraduate education in the US in the 1970s. I think during that time, while you did have some migration going on, I think in more recent years you've been seeing a lot more South Asian immigration to the U.S. Than in the past. But during his time, he, I think, was unlike a lot of his peers in the sense that he was absolutely in love with American culture, just, with the English language. And he used to tell me how he would just get books from the library in English and just swallow them up basically because he was just so interested in the culture and really wanted to have a life there. And so for him, it was just out of, this wonderment and, wanting to have an adventure for himself. He actually married my mom in an arranged marriage, which is very common in South Asian culture. And so they both came here together back in the late 80s, early 90s. And I was actually born in the early 90s, and so I'm a millennial, a proud millennial. And so even though we did live as a family in the UK for 2 years when I was, very young, we moved to California when I was about 7 years old, and I pretty much was in California for my entire life up until I moved to Italy, which was in 2020. So
so you're technically UK or California? I don't know.
In California. So we were actually in the UK for 2 years
time.
Very short time. I don't even remember. I have to go back and look at pictures and talk to them about what they recall.
No memory.
But yeah, exactly.
Oh, interesting. So did you have an interest to do a medical degree, or do you think it's an influence of family that made you want to do a medical degree at first?
Right. So it's interesting you bring up that question because I feel like when I was younger, I feel like when I reflect on what really excited me as a child, I like to think of how I was very extroverted as a child. I remember playing games with my cousins when we would visit them in India where I would pretend to be a news broadcaster or, a host of a television show. So I was very much into, very vocal activities and talking about stories. And I think when I think back to like what I was really interested in, it's things that I'm actually finding a new passion for now, which is communication and writing. I think the science thing came about because yes, my family is very entrenched in STEM. I was saying earlier how my uncles were in chemistry. I had one uncle who is a chemistry professor. My grandfather was a chemistry professor. My dad's in engineering, for example. And so this kind of importance of science and STEM especially was really taught to me at a young age. And I can say in a lot of South Asian households it is like that. So I definitely think was that influence for me to pursue science based on that. But I would say that my interest in science and my passion for it developed as I got older. Once I realized that, it's something that you kind of have to sit down and learn. You can't just, absorb it magically, or at least not the majority of us can.
Yeah.
It is an intimidating subject, but I think once you give yourself the chance to sit down with it and take time to learn it, and also take time to learn how to learn, it's not that scary. It's something that you can learn to love, and you can learn to share that love with other people. And so, yeah, I think that's what I would say as far as like how I ended up kind of sticking with science and being influenced to pursue it.
What did you mean by you were an extroverted child. Are you no longer extroverted, or what do you understand by
Right,
extroverted?
right. Yeah, I would definitely say as a child, I had no limits.
Mm.
I was very open to talking to people and not really thinking about what they would think of me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of people can relate to this where, as you go through puberty and especially in the US where have that transition from elementary to middle school,
Mm.
you start to feel this pressure, peer pressure, about, what are people thinking about me? You know, I don't want to do anything embarrassing. I want to make sure that I do whatever I can to make sure people don't think I'm weird. That people will accept me. And when those pressures come about,
Mm.
it's not uncommon to kind of shut yourself down in certain things that you used to do so freely as a child. So for me, I kind of went through this transition from being this very extroverted, eager, energetic child to a very kind of quiet, introspective teenager.
Mm.
I had all these ideas I wanted to talk about and share and discuss, and all these opinions I wanted to kind of, have this discourse with, but, I was more scared about what people would think of me, and let that prioritize how I interacted with the world than what I actually wanted to do. And unfortunately, it was something that I didn't really come to terms with until very later on in life. I would say, now I'm at a place where I'm more comfortable with it. But, going through high school, even undergraduate, and even my early years of my PhD, that was something that I was still struggling with. That fear of being able to be vocal about something
Mm-hmm.
and not being afraid to have people disagree with you or have people not like you or have people think you're weird. Um, and so I kind of say this to kind of connect back to when I said my interests as a child were, involving communication and writing and things related to that. I think I'm now at a happier place because I'm able to do
You're
those
going back,
things.
yeah.
Right. And even though I'm still in science, which is something that, I'm still very passionate about, I'm
Mm.
able to combine that expertise I've gained
Passion,
with passions.
yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Oh, amazing. When you talk about growing up and being so conscious of what people say and what to do and how to act around people, and we were having this conversation yesterday with someone, and we're talking about how we do the same things all over again every single day because that's how we found the world doing things, and we don't want to look weird, as you said, like weird and different, and you want people to like you. But that's when creativity and innovation and new things are killed. Like, we don't get to do things that are different. We're always doing things the same way. And so also someone else was also saying, a father actually was saying that as children, when they are young, they're so curious and they're so out there. They say whatever they want. They're not thinking what people are saying about them or what people think, and they have ideas, but they're normally shut down either by society or by education mostly. Like they're designed now to, like, they're curated to in a certain way, and their creativity just gets muffed. And the difference between that child and another child in the same situation, but in a different environment in terms of how the environment was enabling, makes them different when they grow up. Like how they approach issues, what kind of fields they are in, if they are actually doing a job they are passionate about. As in, there's so many things that happen between a child who starts talking to finally being an adult. And those things that happen in between them define what they will finally do when they are grown-ups. Don't you think so?
Oh, I absolutely agree. It's interesting you bring that up, and I think it's a very important thing that you bring up because I've had a lot of conversations with colleagues, with friends, with family about, why do we have issues with people, either being scared of science, intimidated by it, or just not simply interested. And it all honestly stems back to early education. When I was a kid, if you're born into a family that really prioritizes education and science, it's one thing. But, I did have classmates who just purposefully or intentionally just checked out whenever science or math was brought up, or they automatically assumed that it was something that they would just never understand. And to me, I always thought that as, very sad to see, because, if you already tell a young child in first, second grade that they're just never going to understand, or that it's too difficult, you've eliminated someone from pursuing something in a field that they could have made a huge difference in. And so, you hear a lot of stories about how people are trying to kind of make high school students interested again in science, or, even adults. But honestly, we need to really focus on getting to the kids, getting to the early education level, young brains, and telling young girls that they can do anything. They can be a physicist, they can be a rocket scientist, but also saying, if you have a passion for something that's not science related, that's fine too. Same thing to young boys. I think just whoever is involved with early education, or who wants to be, I think we really need to prioritize the fact that we need to introduce young children to everything as much as possible, just letting them know what their options are, and allowing them to experiment, explore all of these different things, and allowing them to come to the conclusion as to what makes them excited, what makes them passionate about something, what makes them want to get out of bed and, talk about this topic, for hours and hours, and pursue creative things and pursue innovative projects. Of course, as a young kid, you're kind of limited as to what you can do, financially and physically, but, introducing young children to as many things as possible is absolutely important, in order to kind of maximize the potential as a society as to what we can pursue, for generations to come. So, I never hesitate to tell that to people whenever we talk about things like this, is talk about how can we get people more interested in science. I always tell them we need to talk to we need to target the young children. Yes, the young brains, exactly.
And I don't know. And I think we need to be more intentional about the teacher's profession. Like, we don't take the teacher's profession as a very serious profession.
Right.
And it's the most sensitive of professions. It's what makes this world. It is what makes an engineer, or what makes a musician, or it is that teacher is the contributor. People talk about their teachers, especially when they were younger, either if they were bad teachers, or they were good teachers, or if they were supportive teachers. People, most of the time, apart from the parents, people mostly talk about the teachers. And absolutely. I think we need to be more careful, and take the teacher's profession more seriously, especially the kindergarten, elementary school, that age. That,
exactly.
When you take your child from your home and give them to a teacher, I think we should be more serious about evaluating what kind of teachers are there, what kind of enabling environment is there for that child to grow their brain, not to shrink their brains and shrink their imaginations and their creativities. Wow.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. As you were saying that, I was actually thinking of, my 5th grade teacher. So when I was around 10 years old, she was, I think of her to this day because of how interactive, engaging she was. She made learning fun. She is absolutely one of my most favorite teachers. And even though, in elementary school, you cover a number of subjects. You don't just focus on one thing.
Mm.
She made everything we learned absolutely fun. And, I think about, new parents or parents with young children, and you think about like how you want to invest in them and invest in their life. I think investing as much as you can in those early years is absolutely important. Probably more important than high school or middle school or anything like that. Because of the reasons you said. And I think, I don't know how much more we can really emphasize this point, but it is absolutely critical that we think about how we educate teachers that, want to go into this noble profession, and how we empower them with tools so that they can kind of help, foster this kind of curiosity in these young students, these young brains. And I think as a society, we need to kind of get away from putting people with money on a pedestal, or putting people that kind of fall into lucky things on a pedestal, and putting people that are in these very critical professions on that pedestal, and giving them more respect, giving them more tools, giving them more compensation for what
more
they
money,
do.
Yes.
Exactly. I think as a society, that is something that we definitely need to adjust in our attitude, for sure.
And if you're talking about STEM, if you're talking about making girls educated, if you're talking about all those things, we need to give more education to the teachers who are going to handle those children. Because one teacher handles so many kids. One teacher can influence so many kids. So why don't you put enough emphasis and money and everything and education to the people who are going to handle the next generation? We should do that, right?
I agree.
Talking about education, I come from Kenya, and we have, of course, a very different educational system from different countries. And I usually like to know what kind of educational system is where was where you are, or is where you are. So for you, for example, can you explain how it is like moving from home to school to university? What is the path like
Right.
To your PhD? Because you also mentioned you moved from your degree to your PhD, which is different from our system. So I'd like you to just explain that in brief, if you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so normally in the US, the kind of standard education, mandatory education, is from kindergarten through grade 12. Kindergarten through 6th grade, so from about 5 years old to 11 years old usually, is the elementary school stage. So, the early years, like we were talking about, is the most critical. That's in that elementary school stage. Usually middle school ends up being either 6th grade to 9th grade or 7th grade to 9th grade. Sometimes it's called junior high, but oftentimes it's middle school. That's your kind of, students are kind of in that pubescent stage, and it's that intermediate education. High school usually ends up being 9th through 12th grade, so about 4 years long. Sometimes you have students that end up taking their GED, so they take that instead of finishing high school and getting a high school diploma.
Wait,
other times,
what?
Oh yes. So, and once in high school, depending on how a student is performing, if they're not performing too well, they can opt to take something called a GED. So that is basically kind of like a certification, so that they can kind of go on and do something industrial, or not necessarily, if they don't want to necessarily pursue college. Otherwise, normally students finish off with a high school diploma in their 12th grade, so around 17, 18 years old. And then in the US, the collegiate education is kind of divided into different formats. So you can pursue, if, based on your finances, because one thing I do want to clarify is, I think a lot of people know this, but in the US, collegiate education is not paid for unless you have scholarships or, financial aid, which is also an issue in itself. But there are other countries out there that, compensate for that. In the US, that is not the case.
Okay.
Yes. So, if you finish high school, your options are, going to something called a community college or a junior college, which is a little bit more affordable for most people. And normally you can finish that within 2 years and get something called an associate's degree. And with that, you can kind of go on and find a job, or you can go to a 4-year college and finish the last 2 years of the 4 years at that college.
Okay.
A lot of other students, they can go straight to the undergraduate 4-year college, 4-year university. They don't have to go to a community college. And then normally, yes, you spend about 4 years. In my case, I actually finished in 3 years. It really depends on, the flexibility of the school, what your goals are, what you're able to afford, how intensive your workload can be, because some students in the US, yes, per semester. Because some students, they take on jobs while they're going to school to help pay off their tuition.
Fees, yeah.
So it depends really on the student's circumstances, the classes they're taking, and what their goals are. And most students and most people that go to college, after they get their 4-year undergraduate degree, they normally just go on to find work. And so a lot of careers, for example, engineering, nowadays it's not so much the case, but at least when I graduated from college, I knew a lot of my peers that did take engineering as their degree go straight away into work and actually find really, well-paying jobs with their engineering degree. They didn't necessarily have to do a postgraduate to, find a more lucrative career. And then in my case, since I was in biology, and because of my interest in research and my kind of desire to kind of continue on. After undergraduate, I was able to apply for PhD programs. And so you do hear a lot of people, doing a master's. A master's is in the US about 2 years.
You still pay?
Yes, for the master's you pay, but for the PhD you don't. For most science PhD programs that I know of and that a lot of my colleagues have enrolled in, the PhD program is completely paid for as far as tuition, and you are given a stipend. So it's almost like you have a job when you are a PhD student. You're getting paid to learn. You're getting paid to do research.
You said something about the master student.
Yeah, so the master's student, so in the US, you can take a master's and, finish in 2 years and then again go off and find work. Or you can do the master's and then apply to PhD programs. The only thing with that is that when you do something like that, you may not exactly, it depends on the research project you do, and it depends on, what your research topic is as far as when you might finish the PhD degree. But normally a PhD degree takes about 5 years. Sometimes it can take longer. Rarely does it take shorter, but it does happen. In a lot of other countries, a master's degree is required before the PhD. But normally what I've seen is for PhD, for applicants who did their undergraduate in the US, they don't necessarily have to do a master's. It really depends on the program. In my case, since I'm a US citizen, I did my undergraduate at a school in the US. I didn't have to do a master's. I think for some international applicants who are coming from abroad and they are coming to the US for the first time and are hoping to get into a PhD program, a master's may be required in that situation. It really does depend on the school and the program. But I think the US is unique in that sense, in the sense that if you do your undergraduate in the US, you are most likely not going to need to do a master's before doing a PhD, which saves time, I think. It's kind of helpful.
You've said something about you don't have to pay for your PhD. Where does US get the funding to pay for their PhD students?
Right. So we have foundations such as the National Institute of Health. We have a lot. NIH, yes. And so within the NIH, there are a number of different departments. So, for example, National Institutes of Aging, and a number of those departments are able to kind of offset the costs in relation to fellowships and grants and things like that. And then a lot of these universities, depending on if they're public or private, are funded by the state. They are funded by private grants, private donations. So there are a lot of avenues to kind of support these programs. That being said, it's not as though these programs will take in any applicants. They are very strict as far as how many students they are able to take on and how many students they're able to support. So in my case, I entered a class of 5 other students in my cohort. And even from that, we had to find labs with professors who had the money to take on a student. So there may be instances where, a professor may have money to take on a student 1 year, but then the following year they may not have that fund or that amount of money ready. So you may have to find someone else who can take you on. So
wow.
even
so
though
what happens to your work?
Oh, so normally that is why one good thing is that within the first year of PhD programs in the US, it's required that you do rotations. Okay. So rotations allow you to kind of spend a semester or half a semester in a lab to not only get to know the professor and get to know your lab mates, but also, discuss with them and see if there are funds available for you to work there. So that first year is very critical in figuring out if there is space for you and making sure that you are going to be in a financially stable place. Because there have been stories of labs getting their funding discontinued and students having to kind of scramble and figure out their financial situation. In situations like that, I have heard of students being able to get compensated through being TAs or teaching assistants. So a lot of these programs make it clear that they're not going to leave you, stranded. They're going to make sure that you find some funding, if not through your research position, at least through a teaching position. So a lot of these programs, at least the accredited programs, are equipped to handle these types of situations.
There's something you said, I don't know, I disturbed you saying something when you're talking about the PhD.
The funding of the PhD, or
I think, yeah, something to do with that. I'm not sure what you were trying to say.
Yeah. Well, basically, at least in my situation, the funding was made clear from acceptance. So after receiving the acceptance letter, you are notified how much you will get paid for the year as far as a stipend.
How much? Normally, don't have to say.
Normal. So yes. So again, it really depends on where the school is. So for example, in a school that is in California or New York is going to pay a bit more than what you would get paid, let's say, in Middle America, because it really depends on the cost of living and how much things are in a particular area. So if I reflect, I don't mind sharing. I think it's important information. Okay. I mean, of course, with how things are going with inflation, I can't really comment on how things are right now. But in mid 2000s, 2010s, when I was starting. One school in New York offered about $34,000 a year, and my program in California offered around 31,000 or 31. Yes, and so when you compare it to other jobs, especially in industry, it's nothing. I will admit it is nothing. But as a student, and if your goal is to get the PhD, it's really not going to take it's not going to be too detrimental in the sense that if you're living on your own, you're supporting yourself, you know what your goal is, and you know it's going to get done at a certain time. The time will go by quickly in a sense, in the long scheme of things. So, in the short term, yes, it's not the most lucrative position, but it can lead to a lot more lucrative positions later on in life, which is, I think, much more important than worrying about the short term.
Okay. What about just for someone who's listening from US? How did you get your PhD, or what would you advise when someone is looking for a PhD?
Right.
As a BSc graduate.
Right. Yeah. So when I started out, my interests were obviously influenced by a personal experience, a personal issue I was going through. But if I were to look back and think about like all of the things that are important when trying to find a good lab to do your PhD in, or a good environment to do your PhD in, it's really going to be difficult to decide on that until you go and meet the professor, you go and meet the lab mates, you physically go and meet these people. It's one thing to look up, a professor's work or a lab's work on PubMed and, see which journals they published in and see how often they publish. That's one thing. But I think as a PhD student, it's going to be so incredibly important to understand if that environment is good for you at a personal level, emotional level. I had my ups and downs in my early years because I was having a difficult time finding good relationships in my work environment. But then, I ended up meeting someone in a similar position as mine, and we ended up being really great friends. She was a visiting scholar in my third year. And, that year was one of the best years of my PhD because I had a friend. I had someone to have lunch with. I had someone to take coffee breaks with. I had someone to vent about failed experiments with. I mean, those experiences, I think, having the opportunity to have a friend, having the opportunity to have people that you like being around is just as important as the research you're doing.
Yeah.
I think if you end up in a lab that is doing research that you're not exactly super excited about, but the people in the lab are exciting and fun to be around, and your boss is, someone that you click with, I would say go with that lab versus the lab that is publishing in Nature, every month, just to throw it out there.
Yeah.
I think, as an incoming PhD student, definitely prioritize your mental health, your emotional health above all else. I will also say that it can be difficult to really find that, especially in a world like academia, but it's not impossible. And, I will also say that if you start in a lab and if it's hurting your mental health and emotional health so much that it's making you miserable and it's impacting your work, I think it's important to get out and find something that will make you happy. Even if it means sacrificing a year, do what you can to put yourself in a very good place so that you can produce good work and so that you can be a good person to other people. That is, I think, my biggest advice when you're looking for programs and looking for a lab to join. That is absolutely important, I think.
So that you can be a good person to other people. Do you want to expound on that?
Right, because, I mean, if let's say I use the example of my most recent postdoc, 2021 was a very difficult year for me in that sense because I would wake up absolutely depressed, very angry, very short-tempered. I'm not happy I was like that, and it showed. My interactions with people weren't the best. The anger I felt so angry that I almost wanted other people to know how angry I was. And it made me sad because I knew that I was capable of being happy. I was capable of being, a light in someone's day who needed it. But I was not in a good position to give that to other people because I was not in a good position myself. And I think once I came to that realization, it was me trying to figure out how to get out of that negative state of mind so that I can be happier, so that I could bring happiness to other people in my interactions, in my day-to-day. And, I think just being happy yourself it makes you, it does so much for your health in a way, because when you're happy, you're less stressed. And, being less stressed really impacts how you physically feel. And for example, I think where I am right now, I'm less fatigued. I'm more motivated each day. I'm
Mm.
not, I'm not uncontrollably angry. I'm not uncontrollably crying. I'm in a much better mental state of mind so that I can, be there for other people in a good way.